How do you get close to a porcupine? You might ask, why would you want to get close to a porcupine? Well, maybe you'd like to pet it. They're cute. Of course, petting a porcupine is a dicey proposition. I have read that it can be done, but I've never tried. Universally recommended, wearing gloves. How do porcupines get close to each other? It's a good question because of the 58 different species of porcupines. They all seem to keep propagating, keep having baby porcupines. People are like porcupines. If you get close to somebody, you're going to get hurt. And it's to relieve or prevent some of that hurt that Jesus gave the teaching that we're going to look at today. I've been officially a part of 7 churches over the course of being a pastor, and if I could pick one thing that everybody in the church would absorb and do all the time, it would be this practice. It's simple. The actions are easy to understand, but it can be difficult to pull off. Yet it would make a huge difference in and out of the gatherings of God's people if we would simply carry out this teaching. You ready? Here it is, Matthew 18, verse 15. If your brother sins against you, go and show him his fault just between the two of you. That's it. That's the teaching. In his book, Everybody's Normal Till You Get to Know Them, John Ortberg breaks the text down like this. It's really right there in the words that Jesus spoke, but I like his rewording, and it's nice to see it kind of split apart here. 1, when there is a conflict. 2, you. 3, go. 4, to the person. 5, in private. 6, and discuss the problem. 7, for the purpose of reconciliation. Verse 15 closes, if he listens to you, you've won your brother over. But at the beginning here, notice this first if has been changed to when. This is supported by the grammar of the original, and all of us deal with conflict every day, depending on the traffic. Some days are better than others. Where are you most likely to experience conflict? The kitchen sink? While you're driving? If you say there's no conflict in your life, maybe you're right, or maybe you're just apathetic. If you've been married a while, it's possible that you've worn off each other's sharp edges, but it's also possible that you've squelched some emotions there, and it isn't always very healthy. Every so often, conflict will well up inside you. Jesus uses the word sin in the text for a reason. Not every conflict is over a sin, but if left unresolved, conflicts can lead to sin. Resentment, jealousy, inappropriately expressed anger. I mean, there's such a thing as choosing your battles. One of my old churches, someone put up a sign that said, just because you're offended doesn't mean that what was said was offensive. But if you have a conflict, acknowledge it. Admit that there's a conflict. If you can't admit that you have a conflict, you can never get it fixed. The relationship is damaged. Sometimes a little, sometimes a lot. Once you acknowledge the conflict, who goes to the person? You do. You're the one that has the problem. Sometimes a person will come to me and say, people have a problem with such and such, what you're doing or saying. They make it sound like they've been listening carefully to others who have articulated a concern, but 9 times out of 10 when somebody tells a pastor, people have a problem with XYZ that you have said or done, what they mean is, I have a problem with that. You just have to ask who. Who has the problem? If you're the one with the conflict, admit it. Admit it that it's you that has it. You have to take responsibility, not the other person. Don't say, they should come to me. I mean, I know that we all do it, but that's pretty childish. Part of maturity, growing in the Lord, is to take ownership of how you feel, your experience, your emotions. It might surprise you to hear that after a certain amount of time has passed, emotions become a choice. But moment by moment, how we treat the emotions that appear inside us, that's a choice too. Years ago, I read about two drivers getting into a conflict on the freeway. One man felt the other driver had cut him off, so he pulled alongside. There were angry shouts. There were gunshots, a semi-automatic pistol. One driver killed the other. The man shot to death a 17-year-old girl. And in a television interview, he said, "She started it. I'm just as much a victim as she is." Take responsibility for your emotions and how you handle them. Many of us have a problem with mismanaged anger, and we might as well admit that. Some days are better than others for me on this one, for sure. Anger itself isn't actually wrong, but how we handle it can be. The Bible says, "In your anger, do not sin." It doesn't say it's a sin to be angry. So, the next thing Jesus says is, go. Now, the thing we are most likely to do is avoid that person. We're relieved when the person we're in a conflict with doesn't show up, but avoidance is not healthy management. Take action. Don't wait until you can word it just right. Of course, we're going to try to say it in a tactful way, but if we're waiting for the perfect words, that's never going to happen. The trick is knowing whether you're too angry to be objective. Ortberg calls it the Jim Carrey effect. When you are mad and madder, you get dumb and dumber. How do you keep from reacting too strongly to give yourself space to control your emotions? Well, sometimes going for a walk can help as long as you're not stewing on the walk. Sometimes you yell stop and you can help your feelings in that respect. You might consider saying, "I could be wrong." You may have to meditate on this possibility for a while to make yourself believe it, that you could be wrong. A colleague in ministry shared with me once about a woman who prefaced her conflict to him with this, "I could be wrong," but then she refused to consider the possibility that she'd genuinely misheard what he'd said. For some of us, saying, "I could be wrong," twice a day, with a smile, in a mirror, could really help. And this is difficult for people of our church because we really, really like to be right. One thing you can do to kind of calm down is to try to imagine yourself in the other person's position. We're going to come back to this. This helps if you're close to the other person. Maybe down the road you can be, and so you have to sort of act in anticipation of a good relationship or a better relationship. You may try to understand the reason for them doing what they did. But even if you still don't understand it, you still have to go. Jesus said, go to that person. And remember that anger always sits on top of another emotion. You might ask, why am I angry about this? Is that legitimate? If I get pulled over by a police officer and given a ticket, I might get angry. A couple of reasons. Maybe I did something stupid as I was driving. Turning the wrong way in a one-way turn lane in the middle of the night, that was something that I did, and I felt pretty stupid. But I was also angry because I didn't really feel like I could afford a ticket right then. So if you're angry about something regarding this person, you might want to find out why you're angry. You might ask yourself, what do you want in this situation? How do I want this to end? Do I want to hurt this person? Why do I want to hurt them? If you've ever had someone say something specifically because they knew it would hurt you, well, is that who you want to be? What's in line with your deepest values? What's in line with mine? A lot of this has to do with how well each of us is aware of our own emotions. This takes practice. I'm going to say it again. Meditation. In any case, if you have to wait to cool down, do that. Be aware that the two mistakes are being angry and doing anything, and then cooling off and being passive. The word here is not just the command to go, it's a word with special emphasis, kind of a, get yourself over there. That's what Jesus kind of intended. You can begin to see a pattern here on our list. Each of these items we're tempted to do the opposite. 1. When there is a conflict. What conflict? There's no conflict here. 2. You. Don't wait for them even though you're tempted to. 3. Go. I don't want to go, I'd rather stew. 4. To the person. Can't I go to someone else? 5. In private. But it's easier with other people. 6. Discuss the issue. Can we talk about something else? Anything else? 7. For the purpose of reconciliation, not just to blow off steam, okay? But here on the chart, we're at number 4. I find it much easier to complain to my wife or someone else about how terrible somebody is, or at least what they did was so terrible. But if you can't go to the person, you shouldn't be going to someone else. Going to someone else doesn't resolve the conflict. It doesn't help you grow. It doesn't help the other person grow. It could lead a third party into sin because they'll be tempted to gossip. That's an ongoing problem for church, right? There's another side to this. Do you have anyone in your life that tends to drag you in and make you a third party to their conflicts? You might want to ask them to talk about other things, at least to follow the steps that Jesus has given us here before they bring it up to you. Actually, this is maybe the biggest problem I have with this teaching these days. When people come to me, my natural reaction is to be very empathetic, and when people come to me, I really should take the responsibility to tell them to stop, and instead of telling me they need to go to so-and-so and work it out with them. Once in a great while, you do need a third party as a sounding board, but if and only if the goal of talking to that person is to find reconciliation. I remember having a disagreement with a director of a play that I was in. This was many years ago, and you may have heard me tell this story because it's one I like to come back to for this. I was a supporting actor, had kind of a bit role, but I was also responsible for the soundtrack, editing it together from various sources, wasn't composing it. But I found some pretty obscure stuff that I thought fit the material very well. And then the director asked me for a very specific song in one scene that I didn't think matched the rest of what I'd come up with. So I argued with him, and he wouldn't listen. And finally I asked another person in our troupe what he thought. And this third person says, the director's right. That song is right for that scene. And especially looking back, I can see from an artistic point of view that the director was correct and I was not. One of the things that made it work was the contrast with the other music that I'd already picked. But I kept rehearsing in my mind just how wrong the director had been, and instead of coming to an honest sense of what was needed for what we were trying to do. That was a tough year for our troupe for a lot of reasons, but the director went on to become a pastor, and he had some amazing talent that he was able to express at churches. I know early on he was interning when the senior pastor took another position, and his replacement, the new senior pastor, turned out to be an egomaniac and ran roughshod over a lot of the people in church. And this intern, my former director, kept the church together. He kept a relationship with the members, and they weathered the storm together. So Jesus talks about bringing a third party in, and it's for after you've already taken the other steps. It should be an exception rather than the rule, because rehearsing the problem does not make you feel better typically. In fact, research has shown that the more you go to other people and talk about it, the worse you get. You bring back all the other feelings you had, and nothing gets resolved. So Jesus says, just the two of you, go to the other person, not other people, go in private between the two of you, because it can be really awkward for them and for you if you bring someone else in at first. One thing that I haven't really resolved in my own mind about this text, because I like to take Jesus, at his word here. Sometimes you have a conflict between people of the opposite sex, not married people, but people in church. The head deaconess and the AV guy or something like that. Sometimes you just have to have a third person, I think, to avoid the appearance of impropriety if you can't talk in a way that doesn't look bad, if that makes sense. That can be a role for the third person to just be there and shut up while the others work it out. When it comes to discussing the issue, this is hard. It's the last step in the process. Most people, including myself, tend to dance around the issue. Ortberg calls it the last 10%. You go to the person, one-on-one, no third parties, and begin to describe the situation. And you have to get to the actual heart of the matter, the last 10%, naming the behavior.
Telling someone they were talking too much at dinner so that other people didn't have the chances is not as easy as saying, well, I'm not sure we connected as well as we could have. Or you have to say, other people wanted to join the discussion, but you were talking and didn't give them the chance. So a lot of us have trouble with the last 10%. People who study human communication sometimes use these steps. Clearly state the problem, clearly state how it made you feel, and clearly state what you would like to have happen next time. And then why? That why is, when you're going through all these steps, you have to do it for the purpose of reconciliation. This is not so we can blow off steam and yell at the other person, to correct their terrible error, but to actually reconcile, to fix the relationship. Have you ever had someone come to you and show you your fault, but clearly did not have the subsequent relationship in mind? Maybe you've done this, gone to someone without trying to do that, without trying to reconcile. Remember that we're looking for the experience of God's grace and peace. Peace not just with God, but with other people. I'm an Adventist. We believe in an apocalyptic end to the world. Jesus comes to set things right, ultimately, but we're kind of the advance guard of that time. Something like the paratroopers that flew into France the night before D-Day. Paratroopers of love. If you think you're going to use that for your band, I got it first. We spread God's love, God's peace before Jesus comes, so that when he comes, as much of the countryside comes out to welcome him as possible. The Bible talks about the ministry of reconciliation, and it's something that we have to practice. You can't reconcile people to God very well without reconciling them to each other as well. I've also talked about in the past the idea of who we're responsible for reaching out to share Jesus with. It's kind of concentric circles. There's actually a book by this title years ago where the people closest to me are the ones I'm responsible for connecting to first, and then people maybe that are close friends, maybe co-workers, and most of the time when we talk about witnessing, we talk about complete strangers, but God calls us to minister to the people who are closest to us. And so you have to kind of practice this if you're going to make sure that you're able to represent Jesus to the people nearest you in your life. Sometimes going one-on-one doesn't work. That's why Jesus included the step where you can take the other person. Sometimes the other person needs to know you're not the only one with the problem. If he will not listen, take one or two others along. We talked about that. So that every matter may be established by the testimony of 2 or 3 witnesses. Sometimes the third party will tell you that you're the one who's wrong. Just because a person's offended doesn't necessarily mean that what was said was offensive. If the third party or the fourth party tells you it wasn't worth getting offended over, maybe you just have to let it go. One of my friends said something years ago that I thought was just, forgiveness has to be an attitude more than anything else. You have to forgive certain things, certain particular instances. But if you come at life and relationships with the idea that forgiveness is just an attitude that you choose, that can be a shortcut to a lot of proper relationship and good spiritual growth. Eventually you get to where you bring in the church. But let's look at verse 17. It says, if he refuses to listen to them, tell it to the church. If he refuses to listen even to the church, treat him as you would a pagan or a tax collector. If you're familiar with the story of Jesus, he treated pagans and tax collectors as well as he treated anyone. He loved them. Now, these were not people that were accepted in his time particularly well, but Jesus treated pagans and tax collectors like human beings and met their needs. So if you have to treat someone like a pagan or a tax collector, that's a roundabout way of saying that they need your love as well. What if you're the person who is being approached about a conflict? It's not always easy to recognize, and that can be a bit of a challenge, but if you're trying to pay close attention to conversations and relationships, you can start to pick up on this. When someone has a conflict and they bring it up with you, that's very difficult for them. And so the more grace you can show to that person, the better off you are. We live in a hypersensitive age, and so most of us face the temptation to take things in the worst possible way. I remember seeing or reading something about the conflict between husbands and wives. If there are two ways to take something we've said, the men say, and one of them makes you sad or angry, we meant it the other way. That's key for all relationships. Try to take things that other people say in the best possible way. It's a hypersensitive age, so each of us has to kind of work to overcome our own hypersensitivity. Sometimes we're too brusque to others, too rough in our speech, careless of their feelings. I don't always realize when I'm being insensitive. I had a crash course in learning to ignore when people would deliberately say hurtful things. This is early in my career. On a good day, I can still do that, but that's not every day. But I'm telling myself as I'm trying to encourage you, be patient with others and be patient with yourself. Now, the golden rule applies, do unto others as you would have them do to you, but sometimes the other person's more sensitive than I am. Sometimes they're more sensitive than you are. And so you have to recognize that and couch things in the gentlest terms appropriate for that person. You don't want to bring it up in a way that's going to make things worse or cause them to be more hurt. You have to try to imagine, I guess, what the other person is hearing when we say what we say. It isn't always what we intend or what we think the words mean. Sometimes we can do everything right in this process and the relationship still fails. But that's why Jesus said you gotta love them anyway. If the person cuts you off and you can't make contact for reconciliation, pray for the person. It goes back to what I've been saying a lot this year. You've got to try, by the grace of God, to love your enemies. Pray good things for that person, things that you could also pray for yourself. But if you believe that Jesus is the Son of God, you probably believe he's pretty smart and that he knows what he's talking about here. And really, it does work most of the time if you go through the steps. I had a conflict with a church member once, not just once, but this particular instance. He was distributing published material that was directly contradicting some of the stuff that I'd been preaching about. I mean, it was deliberate that he was going behind me and trying to undermine what I was trying to convey to the church. I'm a big believer in knowing that you're right with God, that safety in your salvation is what makes you free to love others. So I had to talk to him about passing out this literature. It was hard. Like I said, the last 10% was very difficult. But the way the conversation went, we eventually got round to it. And we were able to talk about it quite freely. Eventually I had to go to another assignment, but I could take comfort in the fact that the last time I saw him, he said, if I've ever done anything to hurt you, I'm sorry. And I said, truthfully, as far as I know, we have nothing between us now. It's a good thing, too, because he passed away shortly after. The relationship was never perfect, and that particular time that I had to call him on it, I'm sure that I could have done it better, but by the grace of God, we went through the steps, right? There was reconciliation. As to the theological issues, we never did agree, but you have to love people even if you think that they're wrong. And that's something that's difficult for us, even though we're called to do it. So I hope you find this helpful. Maybe memorize the passage for today. That might be a good idea, a good way of getting it into your mind, because if there's one thing that you hear me say, please take this teaching that Jesus has laid out for us and practice it. And it might take practice, but that's okay.